Welcome to Hey Sister. This is episode 44, Mind Over Money.
Hey, sister.
Hey, sister.
Join me, Courtney Lewis,
And me, Carly Ferguson,
in our conversational podcast about everyday situations.
You can count on us to tell it to you straight with our own sisterly spin.
Consider this a phone call with your own Southern sisters as we discuss with you personal accountability, healthy relationships, managing responsibilities, and contributing to society.
Each episode will consist of straight talk and a call to action.
Your sisters are calling.
Thanks for answering.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Hey Sister. This is Carly and my sister Courtney and I are glad y'all are joining us for our straight talk and sisterly call today. Aren't y'all loving this back to school series? Metaphorically speaking, we've loved our first and second period classes, science and music, and today we're going to third period with one of my least favorite subjects as a kid, but most used subjects as an adult, math. Ironically, as a mom, I find I use elements of math constantly, negotiating numbers of snacks, keeping track of kids' growth charts and clothes sizes, and yes, even budgeting. Courtney, why don't you introduce our sisters to today's teacher?
I would absolutely love to. Today's teacher is ironically a former student of mine. I taught Mikayla Haywood, now Mikayla Ockey, when I was fortunate enough to be a Sunday school teacher for some of the youth in our local congregation for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in San Antonio, Texas. There were many incredible youth in my class, and I've continued to keep tabs on most of them through the blessing of social media. Mikayla was one of those young women and now is an incredible adult. I knew from watching Mikayla as a teenager that she would become an excellent asset to society as a woman one day. She was a leader, athletic, kind, sociable, and willing to stand up for truth. Sure enough, she is married and has 2 children now, and she and her husband are the founders of Centsei Finance, a budget training program. And that's Sensei pronounced like Mr. Miyagi's Bow to Your Sensei, but spelled like sense or change, Centsei. We'll be sure to link to her website in the show notes in case you didn't catch that creative and witty company name. We are excited to have Mikayla join us today to talk about budgeting techniques, as that is the ultimate use of math in the life of an adult. Now, Mikayla, welcome to Hey Sister.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you caught the Sensei reference. I feel like an automatic connection just from that.
Yay! I want to go watch The Karate Kid now, but I think we're actually going to focus on budgeting. So maybe less time watching movies and more time investing in my family's budget plan. That's what we're here to talk about. And we're so glad you're here. And like Carly said, a lot of people don't love math, but we've already gotten a little bit of a teaser that today's not just going to be math and crunching numbers, but talking a lot about emotions. So before we get too far into that, could you actually tell us a little bit more about yourself and about how in the world you started a budgeting course with your husband?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in North Carolina, loving it. And we started Sensei actually 4 years ago this month. So it's Sensei's birthday. So that's a good way to celebrate. And really, just like you guys, we were not really into math. We were not really into numbers, surprisingly, because you would think after we're starting this company and everything. But really, we started because we made a bunch of really dumb mistakes with money. When we were first married, we were arguing about money. We were trying to figure out how this world works. And Dan, my husband, we could not have been on more separate pages. Dan was very entrepreneurial and thinking, oh, someday we'll make tons of money. He wasn't worried about it. But in the current reality was living in $20,000 of debt and trying to do the whole credit card swap back and forth. And I'm daughter of accountant, lived off of Dave Ramsey, listening in the car rides everywhere. Debt was evil. What are we doing here? So opposite, saver, penny pincher, everything. We really collided. And it took us a while. And through our own journey, we read every financial book we could get our hands on. We interviewed millionaires, a bunch of trial and error, and we were able to pay off our 20 grand of debt in 6 months as college students. And then we made a blog post about it, sharing this experience. And it felt like the world blew up because everybody's coming out of the corners saying that they were struggling with money when we thought we were the only people in the world that were having money marriage problems. And we soon realized that this was a much bigger issue than what we thought in our tiny little apartment, and just wanted to start sharing what we learned, and then kept growing, and we started teaching people out of our living room, and then that grew, and then we started teaching people online, and now we've taught thousands of people, and this is what we do full time. So it really has grown, and it's been a unique journey, but it's really helped that we've had that background to be like, we get it, money's not always everyone's favorite topic, but it really helps when you can get the systems in place and learn to talk about it and make it one of your biggest strengths.
That's awesome. I'm so inspired that you were courageous enough to share your experience, though I'm sure having gone through that, you're like rooted in the cause so much more. And when somebody's sharing with you their situation, you're not coming from like, how could you have gotten there? Seriously? Like, you really needed to try that subscription service. And you're like, no, I totally get it because I've been there. And so that's probably so wonderful in a kind of a after the fact sense to be able to have gone through that, to be able to carry other people on through it. So that's wonderful. And you took the time to write a blog post about it, because sometimes it's like, okay, get thee behind me. But that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, you almost don't want to dwell on it sometimes, like, man, that was a hard chapter, but we've closed that book, let's move forward. But it is really awesome that you were vulnerable and that you shared the experience. And then that kind of showed you this could be your calling for life. People need this information, especially in your age demographic, which is also my age demographic, the like mid 20s to mid 30s. People need this information because we live in a world where everybody posts on social media their vacations, all the cool, exciting things they're doing, their houses that they're building. And you kind of feel like, oh, how much are these people spending on their vacations? How much are they spending on their groceries every month? And you find yourself comparing how you live to somebody else's social media lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that you shared, we were in debt, now we're out of debt, that gives hope to a lot of people who think, okay, maybe I should put the brakes on spending a little bit and get down to the nuts and bolts and really focus on this. And so thank you for being here as an example of somebody who reevaluated, and we want to hear all your secrets today.
Yeah, I think in general, we always hear about comparison is the thief of joy and that it's just going to suck you dry. But I think a lot of comparison in financial world happens when you aren't clear enough on your own priorities. And if you don't have your own goals or you don't feel confident in your own plan, then it's really easy to look to the right or look to the left to try to find validation in what you're doing. But often when you feel confident in that plan, then you can just put the blinders on and go for it. And I feel like that is a lot of, specifically that first goal. We went on to accomplish more goals since then, obviously, but that first goal when we were first married, especially then, Dan and I look back on that time with such happiness, which you would think looking at that, you're like, well, you lived in this dumpy apartment, you were working 10 different jobs. How did you find joy in that? But I think because we were accomplishing the goal together, we felt confident in that plan. It just made all the difference. So that would be my biggest piece of advice if you're finding yourself caught up in the comparison game, is to get really clear on your priorities and then go all in on that.
That's awesome. So getting out of debt, would you say that's usually your first goal that you give to those that you work with?
Yeah, that is a launch pad for so many other things in your goals and in a lot of categories. Before that, just having a set aside preliminary emergency fund or something that you can have just so that you're not going back into debt. And then, yes, paying off debt is huge. So much of that moving into emotional is huge because it just frees up so much more of your headspace. And you just learn so much through that whole process that allows you to go through everything else so much faster. All the things that would make you more wealthy with investing and being able to travel and have these experiences. And all of those things are so much easier when you have that.
I love how you said free up your headspace. That's really true. Because if you have debt on your mind, it's overwhelming. It's all consuming. Even if you were to take the same trip with debt or without, that credit card debt from the trip, you'll have a different experience.
Mikayla, we have you on as our math teacher. If you were to be our math teacher, and we're all sisters, we consider this our Hey Sisterhood community. So what lesson could you teach our sisterhood today that you think is the most important thing that women need to know?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions goes along with that idea that I can only budget if I love math, or I can only budget if I'm good at math, or I have to be loving spreadsheets in order to make this happen. And that is one of the things that we want to break, that misconception, and are doing it every day. That we see people that are doing this that don't love math, that don't love numbers. And I like thinking of it as if you're doing basic math with the world's best calculator. And really, with so many of the budgeting apps and softwares, that part can be relatively simple. The 20% that's math is really simple. Anyone can do it. And then the 80% of budgeting is behavior. And that's what I really wanted to talk about today and share with y'all as this lesson, is how to really dissect that and to think about that. And a lot of that comes back to our past and how our past affects us with money, and about how we talk about money, how we think about money, if we feel guilty when we spend money. There's so many things to unpack. But today, especially if you were to take home a little piece of homework, and we'll remind you at the end too, but it is to think about the following 3 questions. And if you need to do a little journal entry or talk about it with your spouse on a date night or whatever you want to do, if you'll really take the time to think about these 3 questions, it's going to bleed into every other aspect of your financial plan. So the first question is, how did your parents or guardians use money, and how did it affect you? Number 2, when you left home and you were on your own, how did you use your money? And then 3, emotionally, how does money affect you when you are stressed?
All incredible questions.
Seriously, yeah.
Wow, I feel like this is therapy now. We just went from math into therapy. How do those questions play out in actuality, Mikayla? Like when your clients enroll in your budgeting courses, how do these questions actually shape their decision making?
A lot of it is that awareness of, okay, when I'm stressed with money, I go on a shopping spree. If I know that, then I can create plans with that, right? I can really try to actually do something about that. If you're not really aware of what's going on and you're just like, I keep going over budget, why does this keep happening? And to find out what that initial stressor is. And then specifically acknowledging the other 2 questions that talk a lot about how we were raised with money and how that affects us, and then how that affected us in the long term. This is something that Dan and I talk about all the time. It comes up just in our daily conversations, I feel like, in some way, shape, or form. So one example for Dan is that when he was young, his family never ate out. And so then when we came to our marriage, eating out was this giant luxury. It made him so excited, so happy. And that's where all of his money was going. And so when we could acknowledge that's what the root cause was, it wasn't just that Chick-fil-A is the best thing on earth. It was that it was creating that emotion for him of this thing that he never had. Then we could start making a plan. We could say, okay, so how are we going to make eating out a priority for us while still hitting our bigger goals? And slowly over time, he realized that he doesn't even like eating out that often. He would rather eat out like once a month at a really nice place than all the Chick-fil-A runs. And now being able to really think about that, that's totally shaped our budget. Just things like that, where you may never think about that specific thing being in a budget or not in a budget. And if you just look online for budgeting tips or something, they probably would say just cut eating out. And then it's like, well, that's a really big part of how I was raised with money and how I view money. And I want to prioritize that. But for me, I don't care if I get Lululemon pants or something. It could be so different, and finding ways for both of those things to be valid in your budget.
And I think that goes back to what you said before about prioritizing what you want and using the money where you want to use the money. instead of thinking about it as editing out so much and not spending, because that is really hard on our minds to feel like we're putting ourselves in a corner of sorts. And where's the fun in that? That would be hard. That sounds like a really good way to help coach individuals to come closer to their goals, which aren't just, I mean, they're financial, but it also sounds like it's very much tied to emotions too. So that's awesome.
Totally. A lot of times the goal even is to not feel stressed about money or to feel at peace about money. And a lot of that comes from achieving financial goals or having enough coming in and not feeling like you're going over budget. But the goal is not have $1,000 in my bank account. The goal is feel confident in my future or feel like I can actually get somewhere. So yeah, it's definitely a huge part, whether we realize it or not. That's the actual thing that we're wanting.
That sounds refreshing, because when I got married, one of our first conversations about budgeting, I don't know why, but I started hysterically laughing and couldn't stop for like 10 minutes. I was just laughing for a long time.
Because you didn't want to budget?
I guess it was just this weird reaction that Steele was like, and then we'll budget this. And I was like, and it just continued. And he was a little awkward about it. He's like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I've never had anyone budget me before.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I was like a spender, but I wasn't aware of my spending. And almost something about that scared me, that somebody was going to be watching my every move or something. So when he brings it up, I just thought it was funny. And so now we always have to pair budgeting with food or dessert, because I'm like a dog that needs a reward to do a trick. I'm like, okay, yeah, we can do that. Where's the ice cream?
Because that 20% means that you need to have a reward, because the 80% of emotions, I love that thinking of 80% of budgeting is talking through emotions. But when Carly gets down to the nitty gritty, the 20% actually planning where the money goes, the ice cream comes in handy there.
It comes in clutch for sure.
Funny story about budgeting for me. I also had not budgeted, but unlike Carly, I really did love math as a kid. But when my husband and I were on our honeymoon, he thought that would be a great time for us to start a budget. And so I just remember sitting on the bed in this cruise ship and pulling out the free notepads that are in the hotel rooms or in the cruise ship rooms. And we started writing out how much money we'd gotten for our wedding and
Oh, that's so funny.
how much money he thought he would make, how long we could last on our wedding funds until I got a job, because I'd also never had a full-time job before. I'd only ever I wrote for our local newspaper for the university for 13 cents a square inch. And so I didn't make very much money at all. And so I just remember him being like, okay, we have to set a goal to get scholarships and to get the government grants. And we need this money. And if we only have one car, this is what we can buy. And I just remember that was a real killjoy on a honeymoon. But
like, can we go to Lido Deck, please?
yeah, can we go join the free Zumba classes?
What other mantras or tokens of wisdom can you share with our sisters today?
I think another one that comes when you're having these budgeting conversations, which sounds like, if anyone's listening to this, timing is everything if you're going to talk to your spouse about a budget, because our first was on a road trip and we wrote it all down on a napkin in the car. So everyone can remember their first budgeting conversation, I guess. But with that said, one of our big mantras, and I still tell myself this a lot too, is data over drama. And the main thing with that is when you are talking about these, especially because it can be highly emotional, it often can turn into a blame game between the two of you. It could be a guilt thing for yourself. It could be all of this drama. And the important part is to, as much as possible, try to remove that and just talk about the numbers. So for example, something that just happened to Dan and I 2 weeks ago. We do finances every week. We do a weekly check-in, so that is only like 15 minutes. We just check in. Is our system running smoothly? Move on, kind of thing. So that doesn't have to be this huge thing. Anyway, we were having that, and we were looking at the last bit of the month and what our flow number, which is something in our course, that's the term we use basically for how much money you're putting towards your goal that month, was lower than what I thought we had discussed. So originally it was going to be $2,000 to our next goal, and it was $1,400. And so Dan says the number. He's like, okay, so we'll have 1,400 going to our flow. And I was like, wait, I thought we said it was 2,000. And initially my heart is like, oh, what? That's $600 shorter than we thought. And I had that mantra in my head of data over drama. So then we could still discuss it without this getting like heated. And what happened there? What were we thinking? We're failures, all this stuff, to just like, okay, so what happened logically, just the data, looking at the numbers, and what are we going to do differently? And now let's move on. It was just such a smoother conversation just by having that. And we see this a lot with clients, especially when you're first starting out, because you haven't had years of experience of talking about finances in an open dialogue. And so there's lots of opportunities for drama, blame. Someone walks in with an Amazon package and you're like, what are you doing? We just had a budgeting talk. And it just turns into this whole explosion. So instead, data over drama.
I love that because, yeah, there could be a lot of drama. There's a lot of differences. Like in those questions, how it goes through and each person can share their backstory or their feelings and their behavior in that way. Because when you're together, even if like Courtney and I are from the same family, but we're different in how we spend money. And you're shaking your head like maybe not.
I mean, I think you and I are more similar in how we spend money than many other people I know, but I think that's where family culture comes in. Like we're pretty similar, but at the same time, me and my husband are more different than you and I are different because a family comes from somebody else. So I agree with you. You and I are different in how we spend money, but I think that's one of the hardest things of a relationship is when you marry somebody and you're thinking you spend money on things that I don't think are important.
Yeah.
So that Amazon package comes and you're like, you got a basketball goal?
Yes.
That might be a real thing now. We just had that happen. We don't even have room for this. Our kids aren't even the age yet to play. But that's fine. We'll talk about those things. And it's really good to do for your relationship because you learn something about each other. Because I think sometimes you have one or both of the spouses of each of the partners maybe feeling not able to express what they think about money. Do you coach your people through that kind of conversation with those questions so that they feel enabled to be able to vocalize those things?
Yeah, we do talk about specifics and general. One of the big things in our personal finance accelerator program, which is like our main bread and butter program that all of our clients go through, is to not just give you all these tools and say good luck like so many other financial courses out there. Our big thing is to be there holding your hand, getting you through all these steps. And so if the discussion questions come up, and not just these three, we have a whole list, but if they're going through them and then they're like, okay, this totally blew up, we need help in this specific scenario, then we can be a sounding board for that.
That's wonderful.
Speaking of that sounding board, let's say a couple comes to you and has a scenario where they're saying, my husband and I are on different pages for who likes to spend money where. I've cut back, but he's not cutting back and he keeps spending money regardless of us making a budget. I love what you're saying of data over drama, but when one part of a partnership continues spending the money and not following a budget, how do you move forward from that, Mikayla?
That's a great question. Oftentimes, maybe you guys don't agree on the end goal, or you don't agree on the roadmap is what we call it. So the plan of the big goals you want to hit, like paying off debt, investing, buying a house. Maybe you don't agree on the goal, or you don't agree on the timeline, or something there is a little fuzzy. So we would most likely go there first and say, okay, is this something that only partner number one wants and partner number two does not care at all? Is this something that you both want, but maybe one of you is like, I just want to enjoy life a little bit while we're doing it. And one of you is like, let's go so fast, and try to unpack that first. And then if that is not the issue, then sometimes it has something to do with in the nitty-gritty budgeting categories that maybe one of you doesn't have enough freedom within that. And so one thing that we love, this is like my favorite part of budgeting, is having a his and her fund. So money that when we first started out, it was $10. It was like nothing big, But even just having that little bit that was not budgeted, in a way, in air quotes, I guess you can't see me, not budgeted,
Mhm.
is by being able to spend that on whatever you want. You could save it month over month. You could go out. You could buy the Amazon package, like whatever it is that no questions asked, you can do that. And so if you guys both agree on that and both of you say, I'm going to stick to this budget, then it's a matter of trusting each other, trusting the system, and then putting that into practice. So those would be the two things that we would look at first. And then from there, we could go deeper, but those are an initial starting point if that continues to be an issue.
I love that. I like that second point, especially of having a his and her fund. And maybe I love that idea so much because somebody gave us that counsel when my husband and I were first married. And it was especially helpful because the big joke in the beginning of our marriage was I wanted bobby pins from Sally Beauty Supply, and they are $9 for this case of really high quality bobby pins. And I remember we were at a Walmart and he said, just buy those bobby pins. They're $1.97. And I said, those won't work for my hair. Those are just not going to work. I need the big container from Sally's and that'll be better. And I remember him kind of griping about it. And I love him so dearly, and he'll not be thrilled that I'm sharing this story, but he didn't think that was important. He didn't understand. And then on the flip end of that, it was nice to go visit my in-laws when I told my mother-in-law the story and she took my side. And that's a bad piece of advice. Don't pit your parents against your spouse. Don't try and do that. But for me, it worked in that scenario because she was telling her son to lighten up and just let her buy the bobby pins. Let her buy the bobby pins. But that actually became the piece of advice we ended up receiving was start with $5 or $10 that you can spend, because like you find those things that you criticize each other for. But if you give yourself a $10 starting point, and maybe over the years you up that to 25 or 50, and you're like, okay, I can spend this much money without consulting my spouse a month.
Well, I mean, this is just the differences in how we might behave, or like our mind might be geared towards one way of thinking. Like my husband is more minded towards building wealth. And like, how would we do that? And envisioning that and working towards it. Whereas I'm like, enjoy right now, make sure that we're making things very functional. And so maybe we do something that costs a little more, but it's easier to handle our situation of life at the moment, have some of the niceties. And so it's kind of like harmonizing those things. But I just love how you talked about talking through it together and prioritizing those things for both of us in a roadmap. That's a great analogy.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of roadmaps, it's often helpful when somebody's driven the road before you and you can kind of know what road to be on. When you're talking to clients, do you give examples of budgets they can follow, or how do you advise them on what budget to set for themselves?
Yes and no about the examples. I feel like we have lots and lots of examples, but like what I alluded to earlier, sometimes that can be harmful because it makes you try to set this arbitrary thing and causes lots of comparison and all of that. Most of the time, the roadmap dictates the budget by knowing what you want and where you want to go and at what time you want to arrive allows the budget to really start happening. So we do have guidelines to give people as far as like, how much should I spend on groceries? I feel like I'm totally in left field over here. What should I be doing? We have little things like that, but then the answer is always being able to adjust as needed, because if you are someone who really values groceries, then so what if you spend $2,000 a month? If you have that in your budget and you're hitting your goals at the timeline you want, then yeah, by all means. That's the way that we've approached it, is by helping them to create the roadmap, helping them to get those timelines down, and then being able to adjust your budget accordingly in order to hit those goals.
I think this is really important now too because of inflation. I think that's hitting a lot of people hard where they weren't expecting, oh, wow, like that costs this much more than it used to. And I didn't realize it until the very end of buying all my groceries, and it came out to like a quarter more than it would have been normally. And so between that and gas prices having fluctuated so much, it does mean that we need to have a better sensei of what's going on with our money, having a good relationship with money.
Well, especially because of inflation, honestly, I have not budgeted in months because I don't want to look at how much more we're spending on things. So if I'm being honest, I've stopped looking, and all I know is that when I fill up my car with gas and I drive an SUV, and it's over $100 every time. I actually stopped filling up with gas when I was at empty. I would fill it up when I was at halfway because I didn't want to see the dollar amount go above 100. So I would start filling it up when I was at halfway just because it was depressing to me to see it be more. But I'm sure I'm spending at least $400 a month on gas because I fill up that often. So it's just kind of scary because when you retreat like that and you don't acknowledge the elephant in the living room, like, okay, this is costing us more, that gets you into a very bad position. So like you're saying, both of you, inflation means we do need to realize where we're spending money and be real with where this money's going. And I love your roadmap analogy too, that where do you want to go and how soon do you want to be there? No two roadmaps will be the same. So I love that you've got guidelines to help people, but yeah, you can't really follow somebody else's budget for how much they spend on groceries because that won't be the same for you.
Right. It's so true. And Courtney, you are not alone in the not wanting to look at your budget. That happens often. A lot of people that first come in, even Dan's sister, so my sister-in-law, she's been so open about sharing this, thankfully. So I'm sure she won't mind me sharing this, but she could not look at her bank account when they were first married and just stressed her out. Didn't matter how much was in it or how much was not in it. Just immediately stressful. And now she totally feels so much more confident in it. They feel like they know where they're going. They're able to discuss things. And it doesn't mean that everything's perfect. You still have things that are outside your control, like inflation, but you're able to feel control internally because you have a plan and you're working towards it and you're adjusting and you're aware, and all of those things really can help.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Mikayla. I can say I wasn't super aware of all that you do, and just learning this, I'm like really excited to look more into Centsei and get a better sense of how to build our roadmap. And I'm so grateful that you have helped people through this because it really is a daunting task, especially to do alone, but with your spouse and wanting to be on the same page and not wanting it to be a big obstruction in your relationship that it really can be. So thank you so much for sharing these pieces of wisdom today. And let's recap that homework that you gave us. And we'll call that our call to action for our sisters this week.
I would love to reiterate that. If you take anything away from this, answer these questions. I promise it really will help. I'll repeat them again so you can grab a pen or just try to think of it in your head or pause the episode or whatever you need to do. Number one, how did your parents or guardians use money and how did it affect you? When you left home and you were on your own, how did you use money? And the last one, emotionally, how does money affect you when you are stressed?
Fantastic questions. Thank you for reiterating that for our call to action, Mikayla. And thank you again for joining us today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add aside from that call to action?
I think that's it. Just knowing that money is wonderful. It doesn't have to be stressful, and you really can talk about it without it being dramatic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As a reminder to our sisters, any episodes or resources that we've referenced in today's episode will be linked in our show notes along with a minute marker timeline. And we will list out specifically the 3 questions that Mikayla has asked you. So that will be in the call to action section of our show notes. We also encourage you to join our online conversations this week about this episode on Instagram at the Hey Sister Podcast or at facebook.com/Hey Sister Podcast. We want to hear how you're doing on this call to action or any ahas you had during today's episode. Speaking of social media though, Mikayla, where can our sisterhood find you?
Centsei Financial is our Instagram handle, so you can definitely check us out there. Also, we send out a newsletter every Friday. It's called Financial Friday, and it's 5 tidbits of things we're learning, thinking about, books we're reading, anything like that. So you can sign up for that on our website, which is centseifinancial.com. And also we have a free budgeting class if you're interested in diving a little deeper. You can make it a fun date night and make sure you include ice cream and all that.
Awesome. I love the sound of that. That all sounds so great. And especially with all the advice that you gave us here on the emotion side of things, now I'm ready to talk about actual goals and creating that plan that has you feeling confident with your spouse. We also invite you to share a link to today's episode to anyone in your life you think could benefit from this valuable budgeting advice from our new favorite math teacher and Hey Sisterhood member, Mrs. Mikayla Ockey. So thanks again, Mikayla and sisters. Thanks as always for answering our call today. We look forward to talking to y'all next week as we continue our back to school series. So lace up your tennis shoes and put on your jog bra because our next class together is physical education. Have a great week, sisters. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. I wanted to ask real quick, what made you guys start the podcast? Was it just kind of out of the blue? You were like, hey, we should do this? Or
It was all my idea. I'm just kidding.
You're awesome.
The sister, we had so many phone calls and we're both wanting to grow. We've got young kids, but that doesn't mean we can't be learning and growing and having conversations that don't just include talking about bodily functions.
Yeah.
So I think for that, it's been really interesting and really exciting to be able to do it.
Carly handles all the graphics. That's the thing. We have different skill sets, and I think that's what's cool about
Pictures say 1,000 words, so there.
They sure do. So every 1,000 words I edit, she creates me a graphic. Yeah.
That is probably the ratio.
It probably something like that. So
If we're doing the math right,
math, it's a hot topic.